Question is that the motion be agreed to.
Speaker.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to take a call in this second reading of the Telecommunications, Interception, Capability and Security Bill to place on record Labor's continuing strong opposition to this legislation. Mr. Speaker, we do so for three principal reasons. The first is that the bill facilitates the implementation of its companion legislation, the GCSB bill, which fundamentally reduces the rights and freedoms of New Zealanders by providing insufficient protection against the spying on New Zealand citizens by state agencies. The second reason, sir, is because it is so poorly and broadly drafted that it raises a raft of questions that have not been fully debated in the Select Committee or by the Minister, who can't even be bothered listening to the arguments that have been raised. Shame, Mr. Speaker, shame. And thirdly, because such concessions as have been made under pressure have been made only to the global majors, the Googles and the Facebooks, not to the citizens of New Zealand, and that, sir, is very revealing about whose interests this government will in fact listen to. Mr. Speaker, let us turn first to the GCSB bill, and this is relevant, sir, absolutely fundamental to the core of this bill, because the interception capabilities it provides for are a necessary step for the operation of the GCSB bill. Mr. Speaker, it is completely nonsensical to say, as the Minister just has, that this bill, quote, does not change the privacy protections. It doesn't need to, Mr. Speaker, because they've just been done away with in the GCSB bill, which this legislation implements. Without this legislation, the GCSB bill could not work because it would not be able to plumb into people's telecommunications systems, Mr. Speaker. Likewise, the Minister's protestation that this is only real-time interception and has nothing to do with data storage is ridiculous, because it facilitates the GCSB bill, which makes clear that storage of data is completely within the powers of the agency. So it goes through the pipe which this bill institutes, and it is then subsequently stored. We oppose this bill because of its instrumental effects as well as its intrinsic weaknesses, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to a raft of problems in the drafting. To say that this bill is too broad and its drafting is shoddy is to pay it a compliment, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it expands the reach of interception obligations to a much wider group of companies, now for the very first time including service providers. So all ISPs are, as a starting proposition, covered by the impact of this bill. Any ISP, even smaller ones, must at the very least be, quote, intercept ready, and substantial ones must actually be intercepted, Mr. Speaker. Now that, sir, is a huge cost, and it's a huge broadening of the powers of the state to access the private information of New Zealanders. But they don't care about the balance between protecting New Zealanders from foreign attack and protecting New Zealanders from the loss of their own freedoms, because there is no adequate protection in this bill. Mr. Speaker, let me get a little technical for a second. In the GCSB companion bill, it provides for the ability to intercept, quote, all transmissions, unquote, that apply to, quote, information infrastructure, unquote, for any purpose to do with, quote, cyber security, unquote. So the GCSB only has to decide that a risk is related to cyber security, and they can take any step without a warrant to address matters to do with information infrastructure, which includes all of the transmissions going across it. Now that is not just phone calls. That's emails, text messages, gaming, records from Google and Facebook, a history of anybody's internet use. In fact, the entire so-called digital shadow of any New Zealand citizen could be deemed to be a transmission for the purposes of information infrastructure and thus is accessible without a warrant under the GCSB bill. And it is this bill that technically makes that possible, Mr. Speaker. How could any responsible party sign up to that? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, when confronted with those issues, said that he would require a warrant for cybersecurity intercepts. When asked to put that personal assurance in the bill, he said, "Oh no, oh no," because we all know that the Prime Minister's personal assurances are worth not the paper that the media report is written on. Take "I will not raise GST," for example, right? Or working for families is communism by stealth. Or a host of other slippery little manoeuvres, which means the Prime Minister's word is not to be accepted. Mr. Speaker, the case for the expansion of these powers has not been made. Let me raise another very serious matter in relation to that. In the companion bill, the GCSB bill, sir, there is no explicit requirement for the warranting provisions to apply to overseas sourced data which is used by the New Zealand agencies. So, as we all know, we are part of the Five Eyes partners. If the New Zealand agencies were required to get a warrant to access the data on, say, a Member of Parliament, the overseas partners were not. Thus, the New Zealand agency needs only ask for or dial up the information obtained by the Five Eyes partner, and hey presto, the requirement for a warrant could be circumvented. The government has never, in the history of the GCSB bill, answered that debate, and today we are asked to pass legislation that provides the pipes and wires, sir, that makes that travesty possible. So there is no doubt at all why the Labour Party opposes this rotten bill, because it gives effect to another rotten bill which should never have passed the New Zealand Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the definitions in this bill are all over the place. It widens its scope to network operators, service providers and resold overseas telco services. Like the GCSB bill, it widens the scope for interception from security matters to economic matters. Well, goodness me, sir. Economic matters could be anything. Anything within the purview of the Minister of Economic Development, sir. Which is, as we know, pretty much anything, because here he is representing the entire government. Why? Because this bill gives him the power to intercept anything that he or his agencies deem to be of economic advantage, Mr. Speaker, and that is a travesty. The only thing standing between New Zealanders' personal privacy and that minister is John Key's word. That's a scary thought. That is a truly scary thought, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the third broad issue which we've raised, which is that we welcome the withdrawal of the odious Clause 39 that meant the government by fiat could prevent the provision at all of a telecommunications service in New Zealand. But we note, sir, that it is only in response to the Googles and the Microsofts of the world, rather like perhaps the Warner Brothers of the world, that this government is ever prepared to change its mind. And to say change its mind might be something of an overstatement in regard to certain of its members, Mr. Speaker. But what about the interests of the ordinary New Zealander? Mr. Speaker, today we drew attention to the loss of jobs in our regions, and the government felt it was okay to laugh. They may laugh, but New Zealanders will get their own back when the ballot box is open in a year's time, and they rise up, sir, to say very, very simply, number one, we think our rights and freedoms matter. Two, you, Big Brother National, have not made the case to take them away. You have not got the balance right. This legislation stinks, and we, the little people, matter. They matter as much as Google, they matter as much as Facebook, they matter as much as Apple, they matter as much as Amazon, they matter as much as anything, because it is the principle, not the power, that should be guiding the government in framing fundamentally important legislation that affects the rights, personal freedoms and privileges of every single New Zealander.
Jackie Dean.
This bill repeals and replaces the Telecommunications Interception